They called her the laundry girl, the quiet Japanese woman who fetched the dirty shirts and asked for nothing. When the Hollis gang took her brother off the Sawtooth trail, the sheriff told her to wait, that the boy wasn't worth a posse. She did not wait. She took her father's blade apart, wrapped it in a quilt of clean shirts, and walked into the outlaw camp at dusk with a lie on her tongue. Stay until the end to see what that blade did at dawn, and hit that like button and comment your city so I can see how far this story travels. The road into Rimrock ran straight as a rifle barrel for the last mile, and Mika stood at the edge of it just past noon, with a basket of clean shirts she had already folded twice. The wind moved the dust in low sheets across the alkali flats, and the sun sat high and white in a sky that hadn't given rain in 3 weeks. She had been standing there since late morning, watching the southern grade where the Sawtooth Trail came down out of the broken country. Kenji was due back by noon with the buckboard and the money from the railhead, $20 and a sack of flour, and the buckboard was late in the way that makes a sister stop folding and start counting. She knew the sound of their mule before she saw the wagon, the particular hitch in his gait that meant he was tired but not hurt. What came over the rise was the mule and the buckboard and nothing else, and the seat was empty. The reins were tied to the brake lever the way a man ties them when he wants the mule to walk himself home. There was blood on the seat, not a pool, just a long, dark smear across the plank where someone had been dragged across it, and the sack of flour was gone, but the trade money pouch was still nailed under the seat where Kenji always left it. The mule stopped in front of her and dropped his head to drink from the trough, and she stood there for a long time with the basket of clean shirts against her chest and the sun moving behind her. The sheriff's office was a plank room behind the assay building, and Remington was in his chair with his boots on the desk and a cup of coffee going cold in his hand. He listened to her without standing up. He didn't open the warrant book. He asked her where the boy had been taken, and she told him the South Grade, and he shook his head slow, the way a man shakes it when he isn't really thinking, but performing the shape of thinking. The Hollis gang had been hitting stages south of Sawtooth for 2 months, he told her, and a posse was a county matter, and the county didn't pay him to chase the Jap kid into country where his horses couldn't follow. He said it without raising his voice, the way he said most things, like the words had been used by 100 sheriffs before him, and he was only borrowing them for the afternoon. She stood in front of his desk and didn't argue, because she had been raised not to argue with a man about his own jurisdiction, and because she already knew he wasn't going to ride. She walked back to the laundry shop at the east end of town and set the basket down on the counter and stood for a moment with her hand on the iron. The shop was a single room with a plank floor and a wash tub in the back and a stove for the irons, and above the door, half hidden by a drying curtain, hung a long, cloth-wrapped shape mounted on the wall. A rancher had asked her once, the first month they were in Rimrock, what that thing was, and she had told him it was a hoe her father had brought from the old country. He had laughed a little at the idea of a hoe hung above a door like a treasure, and he hadn't looked at it again, and he hadn't looked at her very hard either. She had let him laugh. The wrapped shape above the door wasn't a hoe. Her father had carried it out of Kyoto in the last year of the Old World, before the war ended the samurai and the country he had been born to protect, and he had brought it across the ocean and into Wyoming territory and hung it above the door of every shack and shop they had lived in since, the way a man hangs the one thing he can't sell. He had taught her to use it in the yard of their first winter cabin, with her brother watching from the porch, and he had taught her blindfolded the year she turned 12, because he said a blade you can only use with your eyes is a blade you will lose in the dark. He had died in the spring of the second year in Rimrock, of a fever no doctor in the territory could name, and her mother had followed him before the snow. There was the two of them now, and one of them was on a buckboard seat with his blood drying into the wood. She set the iron on the stove and locked the shop door, and she pulled the curtain down from above the door and looked at the wrapped shape for a long moment, and her face didn't change, because her face had already finished changing years ago in a yard in Kyoto when her father first put the shaft into her hands and told her what it was for, the kind of calm that comes from having already accepted the worst possible outcome. She reached up and took the Naginata down off the wall. She laid it across the laundry counter and unwound the cloth, and the blade came clear in the lamplight, a curved, single-edged steel edge mounted on a long oak shaft with a small guard between the blade and the wood. The steel caught the amber kerosene light and threw it back in a thin line down the center of the curve. Her father had oiled it every month of his life, and she had oiled it every month since, and the steel had never pitted. The shaft was oak, dark with years of hands, and at the joint where the blade met the shaft there was a single hardwood pin that held the whole thing together. She pressed the pin out with her thumb, and the blade came free of the shaft in her hand, the tang sliding out clean, and she set the two pieces side by side on the counter and looked at them the way a woman looks at the tools of a trade she hasn't had to practice in a long time. She took the saw down from the hook by the window and cut 3 feet off the bottom of the oak shaft, and the shortened shaft became a stick the length of a laundry beating club, the kind every laundry woman on the frontier carried to beat the wrinkles out of wet cloth. The blade she wrapped in a square of oiled silk, and then in a quilt of clean shirts, the kind of bundle a laundry woman carries 100 of in a week. The wrapped blade went into the bottom of the big willow basket, covered with a layer of folded shirts, and the shortened shaft she laid across the top where it wouldn't be questioned. The basket looked like every basket she had carried into every ranch kitchen in the county for 2 years. She hadn't expected, when she learned to wrap a blade in her father's yard, that she would one day wrap it to walk it past armed men, but her father had taught her that a weapon a fighter can't carry to the fight is a weapon she doesn't have. She changed out of the work dress she wore in the shop and put on the worn kimono she had brought from the old country, the indigo one with the white stitchwork at the collar, and over it the dust-coated trail coat she wore on the road between ranches. She pinned her jet-black hair up in a traditional Japanese knot at the back of her neck and pulled a sunbonnet down over it, the kind of bonnet every laundry woman in the territory wore against the alkali sun. She looked at herself in the small mirror by the door, the high cheekbones and the dark almond eyes, and the fair skin the frontier sun hadn't yet weathered. And she looked like exactly what the town called her. That was the point. She wasn't trying to pass for something she wasn't, and she was counting on the fact that no man in a camp of outlaws would look at a laundry woman long enough to wonder what she was. She was loading the basket into the buckboard when Dalton came up the road on his gelding. Dalton ran the bar and grill at the crossroads, and she did his table linens every Thursday, and he had known her 2 years and never once asked her about the wrapped shape above her door. He saw the buckboard loaded in the dark, and the trail coat and the basket, and he read it the way a frontier man reads a woman who has made a decision he isn't going to talk her out of. He said he would ride to Remington again in the morning. She said the morning would be too late. He pulled his revolver from the holster and held it out to her, grip first. A Smith & Wesson Russian with the finish worn to pale steel, and he told her to take it because a woman alone on the Sawtooth grade at night had no business being alone or unarmed. She looked at the revolver, and she looked at him, and she told him, in the flat, quiet voice she used when she didn't intend to explain herself twice, that her father's blade would be enough. He hadn't expected that answer. He put the revolver back in the holster and sat his horse for a long moment and didn't say anything. And then he turned and rode hard toward town, and she didn't watch him go. The buckboard threw a wheel on the Sawtooth grade an hour before dawn, the right rear, the iron tire sliding off the felloe on a loose stone. She heard it go and pulled the mule up and sat in the dark for a moment, listening to the canyon, and there was nothing but the wind and the mule's breathing. The tack pin came out of the toolbox under the seat, the long steel pin a teamster uses to join a double tree, and she levered the tire back onto the felloe and pinned it in place with a piece of hardwood wedged against the iron, and the wheel held when she rolled the buckboard forward. Fixing things by herself was a habit she had kept since she was 14, because there had been no one else to fix them, and her hands did the work without her mind having to ask them how. She climbed back onto the seat and took up the reins, and the mule walked on into the gray light coming up over the rim of the world. She came over the last rise a half hour before dusk and saw the camp below her in the bottom of Sawtooth Canyon, laid out the way her father had taught her to read at camp when she was small. Cook fire smoke rose straight in the still air, which meant no wind to speak of, and a picket line of 8 horses stretched between 2 pinyon pines, with 3 of them saddled. 3 canvas wall tents stood in a loose half-moon around the fire, and a 4th lean-to of poles and canvas had been built against the canyon wall, with a low dugout cut into the bank behind it, a timber door propped open and bars across the front. A sentry sat on the rocks above the trail with a Winchester across his knees, his hat pushed back, watching the grade the way a man watches when he has been told to watch but doesn't really expect anything. She counted the men she could see and got to 7, and she knew there would be more inside the tents, and she stopped counting at 7 because the number didn't matter. There were enough of them that the number wasn't the point. She drove the buckboard down the grade in the open in the last of the daylight, the way a laundry woman would, not sneaking, not hurrying, the mule walking because a laundry woman's mule always walks. The sentry stood up when she came around the bend and lifted the Winchester to port arms and called down to her to halt. She pulled the mule up and sat the seat with her hands on the reins and let him look at her. He looked at the buckboard and the basket and the sunbonnet and the dust-coated trail coat, and he didn't look at her face because no one ever looked at the laundry woman's face. She held up the laundry chit, the forged one on the ranch wife's paper, the ranch wife who owed her for a year of free washing of the baby's things. The sentry couldn't read, and he waved her toward the cook, who was sitting on a crate by the fire, cleaning his fingernails with a knife. The cook was a heavy man with a red face and a stained apron, and he was sore about a shirt that had come back spotted the week before, and he let her know about it in the language such men use with laundry women, slow and loud, as though speaking slowly and loudly to a foreign woman made the words land harder. She took it the way she had taken it for 2 years in every kitchen in the county, her face still, her hands folding the clean shirts smaller as he talked. She asked him, in the broken English the camp expected from her, where the prisoners' dirty clothes were. The word prisoners landed in the air between them, and the cook pointed toward the dugout without looking up, and he told her the Jap kid and the woman were back there, and to take their rags too while she was at it. She had come for 1 prisoner, and there were 2, and she didn't let her face change, but the word woman sat down inside her chest, next to the word brother, and she kept folding shirts. She worked the camp the way she worked a ranch on laundry day, slow and visible, taking the dirty clothes from each tent, refolding the clean ones, asking in her broken English where the washtub fire should go. By the time the light was gone, she had the layout in her head. The main tent was Hollis's, where the strongbox and the rifles were, and the lamp inside it threw amber light through the canvas in the shape of a man sitting at a table. The lean-to held the 2 saddled horses, ready, a detail she filed away without stopping her hands. The dugout was at the back, timber door, 3 iron bars across the front, 1 guard sitting on a stool outside it with a revolver on his thigh. She had counted 11 men by then, 1 asleep in the first tent, 1 up on the latrine ridge, the rest around the fire or in their bedrolls. She carried the dirty clothes back to the buckboard and set the basket down, and she didn't leave. She tied the mule at the hitch line and told the cook she would wash the load overnight and bring it back pressed at first light, because that was how a laundry woman earned her keep. The cook shrugged and waved her toward the back of the wagon and went back to his fingernails. She built a small washtub fire behind the laundry wagon, set the washtub on the stones, and began to work the dirty shirts through the water in the amber light of the fire and the kerosene lantern hung from the wagon bow. No one watched the laundry woman, and no one ever had. She had been working the shirts for a quarter of an hour when one of the bars on the dugout door shifted, and through the gap she saw her brother. He was sitting against the back wall with his wrists staked to a tent peg in front of him, and his face was cut along the cheekbone, and his shirt was torn at the shoulder, and he was alive. His eyes found her through the gap in the bars and went wide, and then they went quiet again, because he had been raised the same way she had been raised, and a Tanaka didn't call out in a camp of armed men. He didn't say her name or move his hands, and he only looked at her, and she looked back at him across 20 feet of firelit dirt, and she went back to washing the shirts as though she had seen nothing at all. The camp went quiet by the middle of the night, the way camps of armed men do when the cards and the whiskey have run their course. 2 men played a last hand of faro by the fire, the slap of the cards the loudest sound in the canyon, and one sat on a crate and cleaned a revolver with an oiled rag, the cylinder clicking as he worked it. The sentry on the rocks changed shift at what she judged to be 2 in the morning, the new man younger and slower and colder, hunched in his coat with the Winchester across his knees. She scrubbed shirts at the wash tub and didn't look up too often, and she learned the camp by ear, the way her father had trained her to learn a house. The rhythm of the breathing, the creak of the saddle leather on the picket line, the particular silence a camp falls into when the last man is asleep and only the sentry is awake. She had until the gray light, and she thought she had longer than that, and she was wrong. Cleve came back from the latrine ridge a little before 3, drunk on the bottle he had taken up there with him, and he was restless in the way drunk young men get when the camp is asleep and there's no one to perform for. He walked back to the laundry wagon because the laundry woman was the only person still awake, and he wanted someone to be awake with him. He leaned on the wagon tongue and told her to find him a clean shirt, his size, and he said it the way he said most things, as though the world existed to bring him what he asked for. She told him in her broken English that the clean shirts were at the bottom of the basket and she would get one for him. She didn't get to the basket before he did. He reached past her and grabbed the basket and dug into it, and his hand went through the folded shirts and closed on the cloth-wrapped shape at the bottom. She didn't move or breathe, and she kept her hands in the wash tub and let him pull the bundle up into the firelight. He turned it in his hands, frowning, the weight of it wrong for a bundle of shirts, and he asked her what this was. She told him in the flat, broken voice she had used all night that it was the iron for the wringer, the heavy piece, to press the collars flat. He pulled the oiled silk wrapping loose an inch, and the steel gleamed in the firelight, the curve of the blade catching the amber light in a thin, bright line. He had never seen a thing like it, and he turned it again and ran his thumb along the flat of the blade through the silk and felt the edge under the cloth, and his face did the math a frontierman's face does when he's holding something he can't name and isn't sure whether it's dangerous or ridiculous. She bet his life and hers on the fact that he had never seen a Naginata, and she was right, and he grunted and decided it was some laundry tool from the old country, and he dropped it back in the basket and dug out a different shirt and walked away into the dark with it. Her hands didn't stop shaking for 10 minutes. She took them out of the wash tub and looked at them in the firelight, the water running off her fingers, and she could see the tremor, and she couldn't stop it, and she didn't try. This wasn't the stillness of a stone. It was a woman who had just bet her brother's life on a frontierman's ignorance, and it had worked, and she knew it wouldn't work twice, and she sat on the tongue of the wagon and let the shaking run its course the way a fever runs its course, and then she stood up and rewrapped the blade in the oiled silk and moved the basket under the wagon seat where no drunk would reach for it again. She climbed into the wagon bed and lay on the dirty shirts with the shortened shaft across her knees, and she didn't sleep. She lay on her back in the dark and looked up at the canvas and ran her father's forms in her head, the way he had run them in the yard in Kyoto in the years before the war ended his world and sent them here. The 8 angles, the 4 passes, the pivot that takes a man off his feet when he's closing with a short blade. She ran them in her head the way a musician runs a piece before a performance, not to learn them because they were already learned, but to make sure the hands would remember them when the mind went away, which the mind always does in the moment the steel has to move. The fire burned down to coals, and the camp slept, and the sentry on the rocks slept with his chin on his chest and the Winchester across his knees. She lay in the wagon and waited for the gray-blue line at the canyon rim that meant dawn was an hour away, and she didn't let herself think about the second prisoner, because the second prisoner was a problem for after the blade was loose, and the blade wasn't loose yet. The gray-blue line came up at the rim an hour before sun, and she slipped out of the wagon in the dark before it. The camp was dead asleep, the deep sleep of men who have been drinking and who don't expect trouble before the light. And the only sound was the mule breathing at the hitch line and the last of the washtub fire popping in the ashes. She crossed the 20 feet of dirt between the wagon and the dugout in a low walk that made no sound on the hardpan, because her father had drilled her to walk on the balls of her feet in a house with sleeping men in it, and the lessons hadn't been for laundry work. The guard on the stool outside the dugout door was asleep, his chin on his chest, the revolver loose on his thigh. She stepped past him and put her face against the bars. Kenji was awake, the way she had been awake all night, because a Tanaka doesn't sleep when there's a sister in the camp. He came to the bars without a sound, and they spoke in Japanese in voices lower than the fire popping, a language not one man in that camp could have understood even if he had been awake to hear it. She told him she had the blade and the shaft and the plan, and she told him the plan in 3 sentences. He listened with his eyes on hers, and he didn't interrupt, and when she was done, he told her the guard rotation he had been mapping from inside the dugout for 3 days, the stoolman's sleep schedule, the times the sentry changed, the hour the cook stirred the fire. He had been staked to that tent peg for 3 days, and he hadn't been idle, because idle wasn't a thing their father had allowed in the yard, and the peg had been working loose in the hardpan a half-inch a day since the second morning, and by now it would pull with one hard lean. She hadn't expected that, and the corner of her mouth moved 1/4 of an inch, the first time her face had moved in 2 days. He told her about the woman. The surveyor's wife had been taken off a Cheyenne stage 2 days before him and held in the back of the dugout behind a timber partition, because Hollis meant to collect a ransom for her at the railhead on Friday, and a woman with a ransom on her head was worth more alive than dead. He told her the woman had stopped speaking on the second day, not from injury, but from the thing that happens to a person when the world stops being a place where help is coming. Mika didn't say anything for a moment, because she had come for one, and there were 2. She didn't pause longer than the moment it took to breathe, because pausing longer than that was a luxury her father hadn't allowed in the yard either, and she told Kenji that the woman was coming out with them. She passed him the small knife through the bars, the paring knife she used to cut thread at the washtub, and she told him his job. At the first shout from the fire, he was to lean on the peg until it pulled, cut the woman's ties, and run with her for the buckboard, and he wasn't to fight, because his job was the woman and the wagon and not the camp. He took the knife and hid it in his boot, and looked at her, and he didn't say be careful, because their father hadn't allowed that either, and what he said instead, in Japanese, was that he would be at the wagon. She nodded once and went back to the wagon the same way she had come, on the balls of her feet across the hardpan, and the guard on the stool didn't stir. She sat on the wagon tongue and took the wrapped blade out from under the seat and laid it across her knees, and she took the shortened shaft and laid it beside the blade, and in the dark, by feel, with the amber light of the dead fire only aglow on the canyon wall, she seated the tang of the blade into the socket of the shaft and pressed the hardwood pin home with her thumbs. The pin seated with a click only she could hear, the small, clean sound of a joint that fits the way her father had made it fit. And the Naginata was whole again in her hands. The curved blade forward, the oak shaft behind it, the balance point a hand's width in front of her grip, the way it had been the first time he put it there when she was 9 years old. She had reassembled it blind, the way he had made her do it at 12, and the pin had seated on the first try, and her hands hadn't shaken. And she let herself breathe once, deep, and then she didn't let herself breathe again until the rim went gold. The rim goes gray-blue first, then the gray-blue thins to a pale color that has no name, and then the sun clears the Sawtooth rim and the canyon fills with a warm gold light that lays every tent and every bedroll out as clear as a map. The cook stirs the fire, and the 2 card players snore under a canvas at the edge of the ring. The sentry on the rocks is half asleep, his hat over his face, the Winchester across his knees pointed at nothing. Mika steps out of the wagon with the Naginata across her back, the shaft resting on her shoulder, the way a laundrywoman carries a beating club, and the laundry basket in her hand. She walks toward the cook fire as if to fill the wash pot for the morning rinse, because that's what a laundrywoman does at first light, and no one in the camp has any reason to think she's doing anything else. The cook looks up when she's 10 feet from the fire. He looks at the basket, and he looks at her face, and then he looks at the thing across her back, and the math starts in his face, the way the math started in Cleve's face 3 hours ago. Except this time, the wrapping is off, and the curved blade is in the open air, and the gold light is on the steel, and the math finishes. He reaches for the revolver on the crate beside him, and he doesn't get to it. She covers the 10 feet in 2 strides, and the Naginata comes off her shoulder in a long, flat arc, and the oak shaft takes the cook across the wrist before his hand closes on the revolver, and the revolver clatters on the crate and then on the ground, and he's on his knees holding his wrist to his chest, and the camp isn't asleep anymore. The 2 card players come out of their canvas half awake, and one of them has a pistol in his hand and the other one doesn't, and the long reach of the polearm lets her put the blade on the first one before he can raise the pistol to aim, and the second one turns to run, and she doesn't chase him, because chasing isn't what the Naginata is for. The shout goes up. The camp wakes. The rifle round from the rocks comes down close enough to her right shoulder to lay the skin open in a long, bright line, and the pain arrives a half second after the sound, the way it always does, and she doesn't fall, because falling is the thing her father hadn't allowed in the yard. She pivots on the ball of her front foot, low, the Naginata across her body. The sentry up on the rocks is working the lever for a second shot, the Winchester coming back to his shoulder, and she can't climb to him in time. The big willow basket leaves her hands in a high arc toward the rocks, and he flinches, and the flinch costs him the second and a half she needs to put her back against the canyon wall where his angle can't reach her. She runs the wall, low, the Naginata across her body, and comes up under the rocks where the sentry can't depress the rifle far enough to fire, and the blade goes up over the edge of the rock and pins the Winchester to the stone with the shaft across the barrel, and the sentry lets go of the rifle and puts his hands in the air. At the dugout, Kenji is already at the bars. The peg pulls on the first lean the way he said it would. 3 days of work paying off in one motion, and the knife is in his hand, and he's through the timber partition, and the surveyor's wife is on her feet behind him, unsteady, her eyes somewhere else, and he has her by the arm, and they're moving toward the buckboard in the gray-gold light. Mika backs toward them with the Naginata between her and the camp, and the blade moves in small, controlled arcs in front of her, not wild, not fast, just present, the way her father had taught her to hold a perimeter when there were more men than she could count, and the only thing keeping them back was the knowledge that the first one to close would lose the most. Hollis comes out of the main tent with the shotgun, a double-barreled 10-gauge, and he works both hammers back with the twin clicks that sound the same in every canyon in the territory. This is the top of the fight. She can't outreach a scattergun at 10 paces, and the Naginata isn't built to take a load of buckshot. She rolls behind the 2 saddled horses in the lean-to, the getaway horses, the ones she filed away in her head 6 hours ago as a detail she might need, and the first barrel goes off into the side of the near horse, and the horse screams and goes down in a crash of saddle leather and buckshot, and she comes up over the falling horse with the Naginata in both hands and the blade in the gold light, and the second barrel goes wide into the canyon wall, and Hollis doesn't get to drop the gun and draw his revolver before the blade is on him. The camp doesn't press. 6 men are down in the dirt around the fire, 2 of them not moving, and the rest are backing toward the rocks with their hands visible, because they have just watched a woman they didn't look at twice put 6 of their number down in under 2 minutes with a weapon none of them could name, and the will to chase is gone out of them the way the will leaves a fire when the fuel is gone. Kenji has the surveyor's wife at the buckboard and the mule in the traces and the reins in his hands, and Mika backs the last 10 feet to the wagon with the Naginata between her and the camp, and she climbs into the bed and lies the blade across her knees, and Kenji turns the mule up the grade and the buckboard rolls out of Sawtooth Canyon into the full morning sun. The posse came over the Sawtooth grade an hour later, 7 riders in a column with the dust coming up off their horses in the long gold light, and at the front of the column was Remington on his gray with Dalton behind him and 5 men behind Dalton, who 2 days before hadn't been willing to ride for a Jap kid. Mika saw the dust first and pulled the mule up onto the shoulder of the grade and set the brake, and she sat on the wagon seat with the Naginata across her knees and the blood dried black on her right shoulder and the morning sun on the steel. The surveyor's wife sat in the wagon bed behind her with a blanket around her shoulders, and Kenji held the reins, and the 3 of them waited for the law to come to them. Remington rode down to the wagon alone. He was a careful man, the kind of sheriff who had stayed sheriff in a territory county by never being the first man through a door, and he read the scene the way he read every scene, slow and from the saddle before he committed his boots to the ground. He read the Naginata across her knees, and the blood on her shoulder, and the brother at the reins with the cut along his cheekbone dried to a dark line, and the white woman in the wagon bed he didn't recognize under the blanket. He looked at the blade for a long time, and then he looked at her, and he asked her what happened in the canyon. She told him in the flat, quiet voice she had used all night. 6 down, 1 dead, the rest would run for the railhead. Hollis among the down. She told it the way she told the laundry chit, plain and without decoration, and she didn't meet his eye while she told it, because she didn't owe him the courtesy of meeting his eye, and she didn't owe him the story dressed up for his benefit. He didn't thank her or offer her a badge or tell her she had been right to go, because right was a word that didn't pay well in an election year, and he had been sheriff long enough to know it. He turned his gray and rode down into the canyon with his 6 men behind him to collect the outlaws and the strongbox and the credit for the collar, the political win that would keep his office through the fall, the win she had handed him with a blade he couldn't name. She watched him go down the grade, and Kenji didn't say anything, and the surveyor's wife didn't say anything, and the mule stood in the traces and breathed. When the posse came back up the grade an hour later with 2 outlaws across saddlebows and the strongbox on a pack horse, Remington rode down to the wagon again. He stopped his gray level with the wagon seat, and he looked at the Naginata a second time, and he looked at her a second time, and the silence between them was the kind of silence that comes when 2 people have both understood something about the other that neither of them is going to put into words. He said, quiet, without any of the office in his voice, "Your father taught you." She said, "Yes." He rode on, and he hadn't expected to ask a question and get an answer that simple, and the simplicity of it sat in him the way a stone sits in a boot, and he didn't look back at the wagon again. Mika looked over her shoulder at the surveyor's wife in the wagon bed. The woman was alive, and she would go home to her surveyor, and the camp would be in the territory papers by the end of the week as a posse victory, and none of that would undo what the camp had done to her in the days before the blade came off the wall. Mika understood that. She had won the fight at the fire, and she hadn't won the war the camp had started on the surveyor's wife, and the war had never been hers to win, and the knowledge of that sat in her the way the pin sat in the shaft of the Naginata, small and clean and permanent. She turned back to the grade ahead, and Kenji touched the mule with the reins, and the buckboard rolled on toward Rimrock. The Naginata lay wrapped in clean shirts across the buckboard seat, the brother she brought back beside her with the reins, and Sawtooth Canyon fell away behind them. On a different road, the sheriff carried the political win home. Drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels. The surveyor's wife was alive. The war wasn't over, and Mika knew it.